Good morning. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be the first speaker at this festival. I know it's a bit presumptuous for an architect to take too much ownership, but I do feel a little bit like your host. I want to focus my talk today about what I believe to be a dramatic paradigm change in the field of architecture and urbanism, and that is megascale, and the question of humanizing megascale. I do so with a bit of torment because I also wanted to talk about the impact of globalization and how we seek to create architecture that belongs to a place rather than simply one that is imported into place. But it seems to me that in Singapore, in 2012, in the midst of the region that is expanding and growing most rapidly in the world, megascale is the subject on hand. I went to China in 1973. It was at the time of the Cultural Revolution. I traveled the country. This is Beijing. There wasn't a single high-rise building in Beijing. There were very few cars. There were no high-rise buildings in Shanghai. Today, in our own lifetime, in my own lifetime at least, there's a new reality. As a result of extraordinary migration to cities, economic changes, obviously demographic changes, there are now dozens, many cities of many million which have emerged. In Beijing, this is relentless and ongoing. The high-rise tower is the urban building block of today. Shanghai, similarly, is a transformed city. And what is shocking about it is to reflect that every mistake we made in the West in the past 50 years is being repeated in terms of urbanism in the new emerging regions. And this is throughout the world. This is Sao Paulo, where the urban fabric is being replaced by high-rise towers. Hong Kong, Bangkok, everywhere we are getting this kind of new urbanism. Now, it is now about 100 years that since the emergence of the skyscraper, the tower, and yet it seems to me that 100 years since its emergence, we have yet no idea how to deploy high-rise towers to create urban place. Since urban place is the aggregate of many building interventions, we still deploy high-rise towers as if they were singular objects in the city, without a philosophy or conception of how to aggregate them into an urban whole. We do not understand how to create the public realm. And you would probably, I take a risk at showing these images because you've seen them before, because they are familiar. And yet I show them nevertheless because though we see them, we take them for granted as inevitable. And we as a profession, in terms of the thrust of our efforts, have not really focused on these issues in terms of the kind of environment that is being created in our cities. We still think of high-rise towers as sculptural objects in the skyline. We do not extend them to try and explore how to make a city out of the whole. The impact on the quality of life is extraordinary. And of course, the concentration that we are creating creates extraordinary transportation problems, congestion. It is statistically impossible to solve the transportation issues of today, given the densities that we are deploying the automobile. There are enormous side effects: pollution, the extraordinary time spent by people traveling as a cost to the economy. And yet, we go on business as usual. Even scooters have problems these days. But I think most seriously, it comes back to the quality of life, which we are creating in the cities, where there is a craving for light and air and nature, a kind of stacking together of towers side by side, each blocking the view of the other. And what about the public realm? The streets, the boulevards, the piazzas, the gallerias of the 19th century's vital urban places. In the absence of those, we now build malls. These malls are different but the same. They're always introvert, they're always privatized, they're always, almost always, singular function, commerce. This is Las Vegas, but it could be Rome. I think we all know that the public craves for light and for nature, and that remains the ideal in terms of the environment, open space, etc. We crave for the kind of walkable streets and gathering places that really promote interaction. No urban change has ever occurred without a corresponding change in transportation. I think this is important to reflect. If we have a problem today that must be faced, it must begin by facing transportation. 10 years ago, I wrote City After the Automobile, concluding that since we're unlikely to give up the car, as it gives us extraordinary mobility, until we do get rid of it and replace it by something new, we should try and redeploy in a dramatic way the way we use automobiles. And so I proposed that as we have bicycles on demand, we should have automobiles on demand. We should open up the possibility that we deploy cars when we need them, that we do not need to store them when we don't use them, opening up a whole world of interface of transferring from automobiles to other modes of public transportation. It seems to me that that is only one of many answers, but we must remember that without finding new solutions for transportation, it's unlikely that the city will change. The advantages of redeploying the automobile as an on-demand utility would mean, first of all, drastic reduction in the number of cars, drastic reduction in the area needed for parking, etc., etc., etc. And already today, we are seeing this kind of introduction of new concepts, zip cars in America, even the major car manufacturers are now deploying on-demand automobiles. And it might be, just might be, that this becomes the first radical change in transportation in the future. I want to talk about Marina Bay Sands because, in a sense, this was for me an opportunity to tackle megascale, to tackle mixed use in the city in a new way in which to demonstrate that we can create a lively and interactive public realm in the city. One begins with a site, and the story does not begin with the architect. The story begins with the public initiative that led to this project by the URA. The URA created the bay. It created the opportunity for an urban surround around the bay. It conceived of a continuous people place around that bay as kind of a great urban spine, and it dictated to all developers around that bay to link in and to reinforce this urban idea. The concept is urban. It required public intervention. It would not have occurred with private sector acting alone in the city. This is perhaps the greatest and important conclusion in observing this project. So we latched on to this concept of the promenade by the water, which was part of the guidelines for the project, and we hooked onto it or integrated into it the internal urban spine of the project. I would call it an indoor-outdoor new kind of urban experience, a spine in the tradition of the great Cardo Maximus of Roman or Greek cities, the kind of spine of urban life on which all development then hooks on and reinforces and ties up the whole, giving a sense of orientation and a sense of structure. We decided to move the towers of the hotel back eastwards, away from the water. This was not mandated, but it seemed to be the only way to preserve human scale along the waterfront. And so in doing so, the entire podium became pedestrian scale and a pedestrian realm. The promenade is then the beginning of the story, taking in the water, taking in the city. It is a place of daytime and nighttime activity. It is a place of repose. It is a kind of a new urban park. And it then moves in to the indoor climate control environment. The movement of people shifting from one side to the other, depending on the hour of the day. In other places, it might be depending on the season. And the key to it all is in this cross-section that shows you indoor and outdoor life integrated, climate-controlled and connected with nature, multi-level, and running right through the project with great transparency and light, yet shaded to respond to the particular climate of Singapore. And that spine ties in both commerce and cultural activities. It runs right through and connects each and every part. Even the hotel atria linked together into one public path, and again I emphasize public, the hotel lobbies, the atria, which are part of this network, are never closed to the public. They're open 24 hours a day for the public to move at will. And as I said, transparency in the tropics means shade. It means generous shade over the glazed areas. And finally, the maybe dramatic strategy in developing Marina Bay Sands was to try and create public gardens and parks at many levels open to the public. At the level of this podium building, outside these rooms facing the bay, are promenades and park spaces that run right through the podium, cross through the hotel, and link to the gardens by the bay. And of course, the Sky Park as a great 2.5-acre amenity, both to those in the project and to the city at large, with its pools. Swim anybody this morning? All invited. And observatory and gardens and the like. I want to go back in time. I'd like to go back in time and reflect a little bit on the evolution of my own thoughts in connection with megascale. I'd like to go back actually 50 years back, at the time when I was a student of architecture in Montreal, Canada, where I first started thinking of the theme For Everyone a Garden, published it also in a book in the 1970s. The prevailing philosophy, urban philosophies at the time, were Ebenezer Howard, Garden City. Ebenezer Howard's, better bring it back. Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, and the many variations on the concept of a towers in a park of the modern movement. This is Hilversheimer's The Ideal City of 1923. There was, of course, Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse, and there were the many concepts at the time of how the tower might be deployed as an urban building block. In 1959, I had the good fortune to have a traveling fellowship in which I discovered these translated basically into suburbia and Levittown on one hand, and high-rise housing projects, both public and private sector initiative, on the other, both of which made me feel there's a lot left to be desired. And so, with an extraordinary opportunity in 1967, I realized my thesis, which attempted to rethink the apartment building from first principles. The idea was, let's think about this as houses. Let's think about it as houses stacked as if in a hillside, streets in the air, prefabrication, novel construction techniques, streets rather than corridors, and above all, houses open in multiple directions, each possessing a garden open to the sky. 50 years later, the building is alive and well. It is now a heritage building. It has had a great success in terms of those who live and visit the place. And yet, it did not proliferate. Habitat did not proliferate, and the question was, why? A few years ago, 4 years ago, we decided it was timely to go back and rethink habitat. How would we do it today? How have circumstances changed? Has technology of construction changed? And in a research fellowship, which we have in our office annually, we assigned a team to go back to first principles. And it was interesting to reflect, first of all, what we were actually attempting to do. We realized that we are taking the superblock tower, which is a unified mass, and we are attempting to fractalize it, to use the mathematical term, to break up its surface to create greater contact with nature, greater surface to create outdoor spaces. And fractalization is a complex process which does not come without some economic cost. We also realized that we were into the business of studying light and sun and shadows in multiple structures in a way to maximize and optimize the penetration of light and view. This is something you could even define mathematically, but it was important to remember that it was about the study of light in space. And a year later, we had some 75 models of many studies, and we realized that there were many questions which we were responding to in different ways. You had to actually figure out what part of the question you were trying to answer in any particular scheme. And for a while, we ignored geography and assumed conditions would be pretty similar, although it goes without saying that you would adapt a project to its very particular place when you come to apply it. The first, what we called concept A, assumed that the problem with habitat in Montreal 50 years earlier was that it was too expensive and too complex to build. And so we decided to try to simplify the building systems while actually doubling or tripling the density. The result was a prefabricated, load-bearing, vertical structure with plumbing running up and down, following gravity rather than twisting all over the place as we did 50 years earlier, with still preserving a kind of fractalized surface that gave a garden to each and every apartment. And within triple the density of habitat, we were able to cut costs dramatically. The next exercise was to say that the density of habitat in itself and a singular residential use are really out of date. That in fact the densities in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Singapore, in these cities is much greater, and the real potential for urban development is in mixed use. Mixed use allows you to use different activities, the workspace, residential space, public space, in a complementary way, in such a way that it enhances the quality of life for each particular urban activity. And so we took Midtown Manhattan and decided we were going to reproduce its density and mix. And the number of blocks that we picked red for office buildings, blue apartments, yellow for retail, was redeployed to the identical density in a new arrangement in which office buildings formed the lower strata. We created public realm streets both on grade and on the 25th level in a 75-story structure that reproduced the density of Manhattan, and in fact, at about the same height as the taller towers are in Manhattan today, but with a few differences. Big proportion of the residents here have gardens open to the sky. They are public zones of activity at multi-levels. There is the absence of the urban wall that skyscrapers usually form. If you were to build this along the East River or along Central Park, it would be permeable. You could see through it. It's not the urban wall that we assume to be synonymous with concentration of density. And the urban windows are critical in terms of a sense of openness and light. And you could see the entire surface fractalized in terms of outdoor spaces, both private and public, to a kind of a quality of life we do not achieve much today. There were many variations. I won't go into the details. Housing membranes, which kind of created hollow hillsides, sometimes at greater densities, supported by A-frames. And inclined housing membranes supporting each other in all kinds of intricate arrangements to show just the beginning of the potential that can occur when we adopt two principles. One is that we can reshape the tower towards environmental ends, and secondly, that there's advantage to connecting towers at various levels, rather than just connecting them on the ground, that creates a new kind of urbanity. Now, as it is often with research projects, we went very rapidly from theory to practice. The first opportunity arose in Qinhuangdao on the Pacific coast of China, not far from Beijing, in which a private developer commissioned an adaptation of the habitat system in a coastal waterfront development. This development already had extensive development behind it, and the city welcomed a scheme in which there wouldn't be a wall separating the existing development from the shoreline. But again, we were able to achieve very great densities with an environmental quality and amenities which were comparable to what we had hoped for in our research studies. And here in Singapore, under construction in the Bishan area, is again a private sector development. I'm proud to say that it is middle-income housing. I know it's fetching high prices, but still within middle-income housing. It's not in the expensive parts of the island, but rather inland, and with a series of bridges which are publicly accessible, with parks and pools and terracing and so on. We're achieving an extraordinary, I believe, quality of life within what is today the kind of upper middle and middle income housing market of Singapore. These kinds of concentrations, 600 units on a very small site, are achieved in spite of the density and I think mitigating it. In Colombo, Sri Lanka, similarly, a project which is of extraordinary scale, 65 stories, and again aiming for the same amenities, terracing, gardens, etc. I want to conclude with a project on which we broke ground last week in Chongqing, a city of 33 million. I have to confess, when I was first asked to go to Chongqing, I said, where was that? I realized soon that I'm going to probably one of the 2 or 3 largest cities in the world. that it had transformed into a city second or third largest in the world within 20 years. And the task was to rebuild the place where the city was founded at the confluence of the Yangtze and Jialing rivers. Qiatomen, it's called, it is like the gate to heaven, as being the kind of place of origin of the city itself. You see the site here as it culminates the whole development of downtown converging on the two rivers, which was the landing point of shipping generations, for many generations. And again, I saw in this an opportunity, 10 million square feet on a restricted site, surrounded by tall buildings from the downtown side. How can we demonstrate that you can deal with those densities while trying to achieve environmental qualities, both in terms of the public realm and between the great population of residents, office workers, and hotels, and all the various functions that make up the city. And here, unlike Marina Bay, we have all functions that make up the city: office space, residences, hotel, retail, cultural development, all on one very restricted site. And for inspiration, I thought about the fact that this was a city of shipping and of great sailboats coming down the river. And so this became a metaphor. And metaphors get you a very long way in China. So it was the sailboat metaphor. But I don't want us to be fooled about the metaphor because I believe at the end it has basically limited value. What is more relevant is how do we deal with massing? How we deal with light and sun? How do we deal with creating a public realm that connects to the city and doesn't turn its back to the city? These were the questions at hand. And I have to say, which I failed to mention before, that in certain Chinese cities now, there are some very rigorous requirements for light. In the Qingwandao project, there's a local code that requires that each apartment would have 3 hours of sunlight every day, measured in the winter solstice. It took us months working with models and computers to actually figure out the massing so that we could respond to this 3 hours of sunlight. I can't even dream of such a requirement popping up in some American city. To give you a sense of the complexity of this, we have here the different activities: residential, the blue is offices, the purple is the hotel, yellow is the podium with its retail and cultural facilities. And as a diagram, you understand the approach by recognizing that the project hooks into the city in such a way that its entire roof becomes a park, contiguous with the street level of the city, and you descend from those streets into the podium itself, where there are an extension of the city streets as kind of the cardo of the new part of the city, which you see here in a more detailed section. And perhaps this diagram is most telling of all. The city streets simply continue and extend into the project. They go from being outdoor streets, in part they become indoor streets, climate controlled, and re-emerge as outdoor streets. You are building upon the city and reinforcing and enriching it, not turning your back on it, as so many mega developments tend to do. And so the city streets simply extend right into, as you see here, partially shaded, partially enclosed, indoor, outdoor, partially opening up depending on the season. And on top is a 10-acre park open to the public at large, which extends to the edge of the site with a most extraordinary view of the two rivers and the surrounding city. Along the water edge, with lessons from Singapore, a promenade. And then, for the thousands of apartments, On the south face, concentrating on the south face, are terraced gardens facing the sun and the downtown, as well as facing the waterfront and the rivers. We also, at the midpoint of this project, created a great public amenity. But unlike Marina Bay Sands, in which the Sky Park is basically a place that connects with the sky and connects with the surrounding view, I like to say looking at both Malaysia and Indonesia in 360 degrees, Chongqing is a brutal city climatically. It has 40-degree heat at summer. It has cold winters. I believe it has 70 sunny days a year. And it also is blessed or cursed with pollution. And so we created a conservatory, a kind of a space that is enclosed in climate control. In parts, it can open and be outdoors. It contains the public spaces of the hotel, swimming pools, amenities for the residences. It extends from one end to the other as a great public facility which connects the project with the city and the view around it. I'm often asked what inspires me as an architect. The expectation is, I think, to remunerate those projects and those buildings which have inspired me as I became an architect. And yet, my response universally is, what really inspires me as an architect is studying design in nature. Realizing how through evolution, how through natural selection, organisms in nature evolve in extraordinary design responding to their purpose. And this is the wing of the dove, the X-ray through the wing of the dove we just saw a minute ago. You can see an extraordinarily beautiful three-dimensional lattice that gives maximum strength with minimum weight. We use the term beauty, and we are reflecting on what in Darwinian terms you would say is fitness. There are endless examples of design in nature. The nautilus with its growth pattern and its perfect logarithmic spiral. The transformation of plant life in the season. Just reflect on the fact how plant life transforms through seasons and to what extent architecture does not transform with seasons. Wouldn't it be wonderful if architecture could transform through the seasons as plant life does, taking in the air and the weather when it permits it, and shielding and sheltering when it needs to do that as well. And so this question of fitness has to be extended to the question of design in architecture. I think linked to it is also the question of beauty, because I believe that mostly we recognize beauty when we feel that sense of fitness. But that, I think, leads us to a much more profound question about our profession today. The question is there an ethic to architecture? Is it possible to look at works of architecture and say, succeeded or failed? I don't think we should underestimate the intangible in architecture, the kind of sense of uplifting, of magic that we feel when we look at a particular architectural design. But that magic can only occur, I believe, wholesomely, when there is present fitness at a much more fundamental level, the level that affects the quality of our life on a daily basis when we experience an environment. And that has to do with things like light and space and identity and sense of belonging and many, many other aspects, but I believe that they are all part of an ethic of our profession. If I had to make a my own personal little short list, I would say architecture is, first of all, material. It is made with real materials and resources. If a concept is not inherently buildable, it is not using resources and materials appropriately. The concept of architecture must be rooted in its materiality, and it must be rooted in the resources which it deploys, which is what we call, for shortcut, sustainability or green architecture, or whatever your favorite term is. But also, architecture is rooted in program, in the life intended in a building. As Louis Kahn used to say, let the building be what it wants to be. And it seems to me that there is only one question for the design of a school: is it a wonderful place for learning? And similarly, I think architecture has to do with place. You cannot evolve a design which is not rooted in its site, in its traditions, in its culture. It is bound to feel foreign and not belonging when you do. And it goes without saying that all of this, which has always been true of architecture, is transformed by our issue today. We are building at a scale, at a size, at a density we have not in the past, and we have to begin to understand how to cope with it in terms of creating a humane environment. And so I'd like to conclude with a poem which I wrote 20 years ago, and which I keep going back to because it seems to sum up my feelings about us as architects. He who seeks truth shall find beauty. He who seeks beauty shall find vanity. He who seeks order shall find gratification. He who seeks gratification shall be disappointed. He who considers himself the servant of his fellow beings shall find the joy of self-expression. He who seeks self-expression shall fall into the pit of arrogance. Arrogance is incompatible with nature. Through nature, the nature of the universe and the nature of man, we shall seek truth. If we seek truth, we shall find beauty. Thank you very much.
My name is Chan Soo Kian. I'm at the World Architecture Festival. I'm very privileged to have a conversation with Moshe Safdie.
Pleasure.
Mr. Safdie, I want to ask you a few questions. The ethos of your design sensibility are very humanist. You talk in terms of scale, proportion, structure, and relationship to human experience. Some of your larger projects refer to Greek and Roman typologies, the Stoa, Agora, very human-centric. I want to know, do you consider yourself a classical architect in a non-orthodox sense, in the way that Louis Kahn is a classicist in spirit?
I think there's many interpretations to the term classicism. I think in the archaic sense of classicism, I feel very much a classicist. You know, when I think of Greek urbanism, even Roman urbanism, in terms of the order that prevailed in the conception of classicism, I feel very much a classicist. If you think of later classicism, for example, the Beaux-Arts interpretation of grand, symmetrical, and that's a way that some people relate to that term today, then I don't think I'm a classicist. But certainly my work draws on the past, as well as trying to look forward and tries to connect what's relevant about the past in terms of where we go forward. And in that sense, I think I'm very much a classicist, as Kahn was, looking back and looking forward.
Okay. Now, you spoke quite a bit in your lecture about placemaking, the concept of a building being grounded in place. How do you feel about architects today practicing a genre that's very universal? And in your design vocabulary, how do you ground your building in its place beyond just climate in your own design language? For example, the Marina Bay Sands, how is it Singaporean in its conception?
I think that the question of architecture belonging is a very complex one. Because in a sense, the first ones in recent times to explore the sense of belonging in a pastiche way is Disney. You know, creating environments of bygone times, recreating them literally. Clearly, that's not latching onto a culture. That is mimicking that culture. So when you come today to build in a place, and today we build in many countries at the same time, architects go from country to country, it's extraordinary responsibility because it's so easy to come with your preconceptions, with your own experience and say, this is good for you. But saying this is good for you, or I think that's good for you, does not make it feel to the people for whom you're building that they belong, that it belongs to them. I remember when I was first chosen by the Chief Minister of the Punjab to design the Sikh National Museum, the locals said, why do we need to import an architect? What does he know about Sikhism? And in fact, it took me a long time to really get into the culture, understand, have my antennas out there, and reinterpret it. I did not copy what they might have done for Gurdwara design. I tried to reinterpret. In Singapore, in Marina Bay Sands, I would say the urbanism is really building upon the conception of the URA, of creating this bay. But the architectural interpretation is about really finding how to create an urban place, the public realm I like to call it, because it's like in the grand tradition of the Agora, the Corridor Maximus, the great urban space, the boulevards even of the 19th century. How do you create it in a place that is tropical, that is hot, where people love the outdoors, that they migrate during the day and night. I mean, they go out to the outdoors, they come back for shelter during the day. It's a very particular lifestyle, which I try to capture here, but not in a private sense of how you would make an apartment or a house, but the public realm, the promenade, the grand arcade, the sky park as an outdoor space, the terraces on the podium which sort of overlook the cities. All these are spaces for public life which try to capture the way Singaporeans interact with their public realm.
So in a sense, what you strive to resolve in your buildings is making appropriate building for the sense of place rather than searching for perhaps an identity for the country that you are designing for. How important is that?
Both are true. Both are true. I'll give you another example. I'm designing a complex in Chongqing. It's about the same scale as this. It's mixed use, urban, high density. But this Chongqing is different climate. Very hot summer, very cold winter, terrible pollution. What here was a sky park, crowning the building, in Chongqing is a kind of enclosed garden space, a conservatory, stretching mid-place, opening at certain times, closed at others, air-conditioned, in a completely different kind of public realm because the climate is different. At the same time, architecture does contribute to identity. And so I think you try to make a building which people want to possess. Here I would think the Art Science Museum is the closest to a building that aims to be a symbol of the place. And I would hope with years people will feel about it that it expresses the spirit of the place.
Very much so. And my third question has to do with sustainability. Do you feel that architects today almost feel the obligation to be green and sustainable in practice? And I want to ask you this question. If you have to choose between a green feature and a feature that delights the user, if you have to choose, which would it be?
I think this is an excellent question because it emphasizes that sustainability is relative to the environment you create. I'll give a banal example. If you design a school and you have no windows in it, it will conserve energy. It will be very efficient to ventilate. But what does it do to the human spirit of the student and the teacher? It's a disaster. You design a school, you want to have openness, you want to have outdoor spaces, you want to have transparency. Sustainability is achieving the environmental goal with a minimum resources and means. For example, the place we're sitting in here is a grand terrace which gives you outdoor beautiful space. There's lots of transparency, so we could enjoy the downtown. But there are devices to shade the sun and cut it off so it doesn't heat up and consume a lot of energy. So sustainability has to be thought of in terms of the environmental objective. And in that respect, it's difficult not to be cynical about the way the profession relates to this question. And you see that when you're viewing presentations of architects these days. First of all, a little bit of green on the building makes it green. A few trees here and there makes it green. The whole notion of sustainability is conceived as a kind of formula, but I like to call it designing responsibly. Better term than sustainability, because on one hand, the environment should be wholesome and uplifting. On the other, it should be achieved with the minimum means. Minimum means is not just energy, it's the materials you use, it's the logicalness of the structure, it's the inherent buildability of a concept so that it uses materials logically and effectively. And so this is a subject that needs to be much more explored in the kind of lingo of the profession.
So can I infer that you're a humanist and therefore you would choose the experience if you had to over a technological solution of sustainability?
I would certainly say the impact on human lives comes first. If I believe light is necessary, I bring light in. If I believe view and openness is necessary, I bring them in. Then I try to do it with the maximum means, but I will not meet an environmental objectives at the expense of the environment.
That's understood. One last question, two questions. How is your academic experience at Harvard, at Dean of Urban Studies, affect your professional practice? And well, you're still involved in some.
I think there was a major impact of my teaching on my practice and vice versa. And I think it was good fortune that the post I accepted when I went there in 1978 was the director, chairman of urban design. Because until that time, I practiced urban design, but thought of myself as an architect. In other words, I dealt with a big scale, new cities, new urban sectors, but I thought as an architect. And I think after the 12 years at Harvard, I certainly realized that urban design is a discipline in its own. When you design a city, you intervene in a different way than you do as an architect. The things you control are different from what you control as an architect. You need to think at the scale and at a level of intervention that's different. And the best is when you can start, when you come to the point where you think urban design and architecture in such an integrated way that they become one.
So Marina Bay Sands has been such a large building in itself, involves urban design thinking. How much latitude do you have in negotiating with the planning authorities on this? Did you get to make suggestions and modify the planning guidelines at all?
I would start by saying that in Marina Bay Sands, I said from day one, this is a microcosm of the city. Can't think of it as a building. It is a piece of city made up of multiple buildings. Now, in terms of the URA and the planning authorities in Singapore, it began well for me because the guidelines were guidelines I was very sympathetic to. For example, half the roof space has to be green and publicly accessible. For example, the whole idea of the promenade and the view corridors. I built upon these to create the urban organization of the project. But at some points I went further. For example, I chose to set the high-rise buildings back east, away from the water. And this was well accepted because I had a wonderful, mutually respectful dialogue with them. And as we went into implementation, they played a very important role in maintaining the qualities that were promised in the initial round so that the project respected these amenities that were part of the original design. So I would say that the working relationship here was unique. In some ways I say URA was in part the client for this project.
Do you have any advice on a young architect trying to navigate a successful practice today?
Well, it's a complicated world out there. It's a world of great scale of projects,
We used to think of architectural practice as individual and singular. You start doing a house or a villa, and then it goes and grows. Today, young architects sometimes get together in groups. They get together early because they realize they need multiple talents, multiple tasks. They think that they can achieve, greater and more ambitious projects in doing so. At the end, it comes down to the individual designer, though. And my advice is only go there if you're passionate, because it's a hard world out there for architecture. It's a tough world. We're not always respected. We're not always listened to. You got to be very passionate to stick with it and to prevail in this world as an architect. So if you love it, go for it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Safdie, for sharing your views. Thank you once again for coming to Singapore.
Thank you very much.